Steel reminds me a little of the 1990 Flash pilot. That's an odd comparison, I know, but they're both generally lighthearted and optimistic DC characters given the Batman treatment after his huge success at the box office. With Man of Steel, we have another DC movie co-plotted by Christopher Nolan and David Goyer, an attempt at a somewhat grounded Superman world named after a popular moniker for your superhero rather than using his actual name in the title, just like The Dark Knight, and scored, once again, by Hans Zimmer. We'll never really know if this approach would have continued to be successful because the very next outing for this Superman is a fight with Batman himself. There's a surefire way to keep a polarized audience. Just add Batman! So we've got the same guys who came up with Batman Begins writing what's essentially Superman Begins. It's another modern take on a classic superhero origin, postulating what his motivations might be and how the world might react to him if he lived in a universe more like our own than like some of the comics he comes from. It watches like Batman Begins if Bruce just did stuff but never talked about why. There's a real emphasis here on the alien side of Superman and on the Kryptonian mythology that creates a fresh approach and helps to warrant an umpteenth Superman origin story. I love this classic sci-fi premise. These Kryptonians mastered their harsh environment but played God and didn't respect nature. They were so obsessed with controlling their own nature that they hollowed themselves out the same way they hollowed out their planet's core. So by the time Krypton explodes, these people are arguably hardly people at all, but rather biological machines programmed to fulfill a certain function in society. Jor-El, a scientist designed to find answers in the natural world, wants to save what Krypton once was and what it should be. While Zod, a military man designed to protect the status quo, wants to save what Krypton is now. Zod's goals are fundamentally flawed because he doesn't recognize that the system he's so desperate to perpetuate is the reason they're screwed. The inherent optimism in Jor-El's logic is that he comes to it empirically. His own programming leads him to believe that allowing people to choose for themselves is the only way for an intelligent species to prosper. It's a loophole in the design. So all the inherent questions about what makes a man in the way Krypton ends informs what Superman will ultimately stand for. I really like the idea that Krypton is a cautionary tale that Superman would use to lead humanity on a path away from its own destruction. Superman is given a mission by Jor-El he can choose to accept or ignore. Unlike the societal role embedded in Jor-El's DNA, he had no choice in. He's the embodiment of the idea that every person has to face that choice to some degree. Unfortunately, a lot of this is compacted into that first 15 minutes, and it's hard to process the grander ideas while trying to play catch-up. It's like I walked into an epic Krypton movie right in the middle of the climax and then stayed for the sequel, and I find myself yearning for the first hour and 45 minutes of Jor-El's movie while I'm watching the not nearly as interesting and sometimes off-putting Superman stuff, which is not at all how you want to feel watching a movie called Man of Steel, which, by the way, as a title, isn't like The Dark Knight and actually has something to do with what the story's about. On paper, the idea of putting the entire Kryptonian civilization inside Superman so he's literally the last great hope for both Krypton and Earth has potential. But it gets real convoluted real fast. What exactly does Jor-El expect Clark to do with the Codex when he grows up, if anything? Jor-El's hologram talks about cohabitation with Zod, and he talks to Clark about being a bridge between two peoples, but he doesn't even tell Clark about the Codex initially. This is Jor-El's solution to the survival of his race, so I don't think he'd try to save the Codex just to be theatrical. Although replacing Terrence Stamp's Kneel Before Zod with I Will Find Him is lame and unintentionally as funny as anything Bane says in The Dark Knight Rises, I like that he's a totally different character with understandable motivations. But what he wants doesn't require genocide. Why does New Krypton have to be Earth? And if you could build it somewhere else, why risk putting it on the one planet with a guy that has all your powers and has had the time to get good at using them? It bugs me when Snyder says in the commentary that he tried to approach this like no one had ever made a Superman movie before, because when it's really working for me, it's because I'm familiar with what came before and enjoying how he's subverting it. Sometimes it's clever or inspired, like the way Clark and Lois meet and the way it shakes up that standard dynamic by ending the film with Clark and Lois meeting in the Daily Planet for the first time, but her not only knowing him already, but being his only confidant. And wow, Amy Adams has really come up in the world after all those kryptonite diet shakes. And it's not for no reason, as Lois represents Clark's newfound hope in the potential altruism of mankind. As he falls in love with Lois, he falls in love with humanity. But it's not on screen nearly enough, and it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And also, introducing the whole world to Kal-El before he's Superman is really interesting, making it harder for him to gain people's trust right away, because he's been secretly living among them all this time, But then some of those changes feel like it's just trying too hard. Like when it tries to set itself apart from the first Donner film by taking what's sort of the movie's second act and sprinkling it awkwardly throughout the movie as a non-linear series of flashbacks that interrupt the narrative and make the pacing uneven before they really inform the scene they're set before or butting in the middle of. Jonathan Kent himself is one of those changes for the sake of change. Instead of the solid moral upbringing that compels Clark to always act selflessly, he has scared parents that teach him not to use his powers and to even sacrifice human beings in the moment so he'll be unencumbered when he's ready to save a lot more later. The way everybody in the commentary talks about Clark's parents, it's like they're the same model parents we're used to, and like Clark still gets his values from them. But that's not really the movie I'm watching. Jor-El wants Clark to act, and Jonathan wants him to wait, at least until some vague, undefined time, as the world is ready for him to act. Get rid of that nonsense, and it works a lot better. We could have had a really interesting moral argument between Jor-El and Jonathan, a clear optimism versus pessimism debate. Man, that tornado scene is one of the most contrived situations I have ever seen in a movie. Yes, he's trying to save a world that has forsaken him, and that's like Jesus. We get it. But what about the situation finally opens Clark's eyes? Clark, who always defies his father and risks his secret coming out to help people. Pile all this up, and you've got a paranoid farmer who tells his son maybe he should let a bus full of kids die rather than let anyone find out about his superpowers, because he watched his kid run around in a red cape once and realized he was destined for some sort of greatness that the world would someday suddenly somehow be ready for. And he thinks overpasses are safe places to hide from tornadoes. I think finding a spaceship with a baby in it knocked a few screws loose. If Clark had saved him, he would have gotten up the next day, plowed under his corn, and built a baseball diamond. Man of Steel presents us with two different Supermans. Supermen? What we're supposed to see is the man who's a compulsive hero, who finds hope in people through Lois and returns that hope to the world by picking us over the Kryptonians. But the other Superman is the prop that fuels big action scenes. We're not supposed to think at all about what he does when the punches start flying. We're not really telling any story during these explosion fests, and it's hard for me not to just tune out, which is why I didn't even notice the collateral damage the first time I saw this movie. It doesn't feel like a setup movie that sees Superman making a lot of mistakes he's going to have to pay for later. When Superman kills Zod, is his value system firmly in place, or is this a defining moment? I can't answer that. And that's why I think a lot of people find that scene so distasteful. I think a lot of viewers could be made to believe he had no choice and that the alternative was much worse. And then we can simply argue about whether or not Superman should ever be placed in that situation. We have to be in Superman's head, or that scene doesn't work any more than Jonathan's death does. And this scene is almost as contrived. This is supposed to be the first movie of your DC shared universe, and you're going to have Superman snap a guy's neck? Really? I just think if you're going to go there, you have to rewrite your movie and naturally build up to it. There's just enough in Zod's taunting that I understand why Superman thinks he has no choice once I sit down and really think about it. But it all happens too fast, and the overall pacing is so wonky it seems to come out of nowhere. Superman lets out a gut-wrenching, haunting scream, echoing the one he belted out when he let his father die. We know that Superman lives to preserve life, but I don't know if we've seen enough of that to really appreciate how hard this is supposed to be for him. It's all in the presentation. Tell a story and add action to taste. There's not some magic recipe that gives you the perfect ratio of discussion to butt-kicking to make an audience invested in your Superman. Having power can be as scary and difficult and make for great drama as being powerless. The story is secondary to the action, and that's a huge detriment here, with a script that has a lot of big ideas and complicated mythology. Why didn't Snyder just make a 2-hour live-action Fleischer cartoon? That would have been awesome. It's unbelievable just how much is left on the cutting room floor, and I don't just mean footage. I mean things that were built, and he just doesn't put a camera on. I learned 5 times more about what this Krypton is supposed to be in the 15 minutes he and his crew talk about it in the commentary than I did in the film. Man of Steel is like a gallery of paintings that mostly are really interesting and had a lot of artistic merit on their own, but hang them all up in a room together and the ensemble just doesn't make sense. The questions about the nature of life with the Krypton stuff are fascinating. Nearly every casting choice is great, and I actually like this Superman when I ignore the stuff all the characters around him don't seem to notice he's doing either. But Snyder struggles to take all these elements and create a cohesive whole, and he just doesn't know when to show, when to tell, and when to stop and smell the roses. This is another impossible film to score, but just as with Rises, it's certainly above average in the grand scheme of superhero movies. So I'm also giving Man of Steel a 2.5 out of 4.